Today we're traveling back in history for some revolutionary Halloween fun with Batsy Ross, Spooky Flag Maker. Welcome to Up All Night DIY. I'm Monica. Thanks for joining me. I'm hanging with my talented friends, the hostesses with the mostesses, Shelly of Repurposed My Way and Dawn of Shabby Meets Bling for the Rustic Wednesday, but on Saturday, Fall Halloween collab. You'll find links to their channels along with a link to the playlist in the description box. We have a famous flag maker to create, so let's get into it. We're going to need some Dollar Tree foam pieces. I have here a 2.3 inch foam ball, a foam egg. This was an Easter pick. I sanded all the glitter from it, and I have the bottom 2.5 inches of a foam cone, also from the Dollar Tree. And I'm going to use a toothpick here to roughen up the surface. This will give it some texture so that our clay will stick to it. And we're also going to need a scrap from another 2.3 inch ball, which I'll flatten the top by just pushing it on the table. And of course, we're going to need some toothpicks. I'll be using some Model Magic air dry clay. I've colored mine with acrylic paint, and I'll link a video that shows how to do it. It's really easy, but you can use whatever clay you prefer. So the first thing I'm going to do is press a flat spot on the bottom of my foam ball. This is going to be Batsy's head. I'm going to cut a flat spot on the top and bottom of the egg shape. This was like a spongy kind of foam, so I wasn't able to just push it flat. That's why I'm cutting it. And this is going to be her bodice. I'm going to use a wee bit of Sobo craft glue and a toothpick to attach the scrap piece of the foam ball to the top of the cone remnant. This will make up her skirt. Right, now that all of our styrofoam pieces are ready, we can grab a handful of clay. I've colored mine with Americana Cadmium Orange, and we're going to knead it to condition it, and then we're going to roll it out nice and flat. I'll wrap my foam with the clay, pressing it to make sure that it's well adhered. And I'll cut away any excess. I'm going to keep that excess handy so that I can fill in any bare spots. And once I get the ball completely covered, I'll roll it around on my table to smooth it out as best I can. So the next thing I want to do is add her features. So I'm going to roll a small ball of orange clay and cut it in half to create her cheeks. Cutting the ball in half gives each half an oval shape, which is just the perfect shape for the cheeks. I'm going to place them where I'd like them to go, and then I'm going to use the handle of my clay tool to roll over the seam of the cheek where it meets the face. This will incorporate it with the clay that's already on her head. You know what I'm saying? It'll make it look like it's more one piece instead of separate pieces. I'll use my clay tool handle to create a dimple. We're going to roll out multiple small canes of clay. These will be the ribs that are going to go around her pumpkin head to give it that pumpkin bumpy shape. I'm going to cut a small section off of this cane here, and then I'll cut that in half. This is going to be the rib that would be down the center of her face, but we're only going to attach a small piece to the top of her head, kind of make it look like hair, and then we'll also attach a small piece where her chin would be. This way it gives us the effect of the rib, but it won't be in the way where we're going to paint her face. You know what I'm saying? And once again, I'm going to incorporate them by rolling over the seam with the handle of my clay tool. Now we'll roll more canes of clay that will serve as the pumpkin ribs. So I'm going to start on either side of her face, adding a cane of clay and incorporating it. And then we're just going to continue around her head until she has that whole pumpkin look. When the clay feels a wee bit dry, I take a dampened paintbrush and just gently go over the clay, and then it makes it easier to incorporate it. So we're just going to continue around her head. Doesn't have to be perfect. We just want, to give the general appearance of a pumpkin head. And now that we have all the ribs incorporated and the pumpkin looks like a pumpkin, we can set it aside to dry, and we're going to work on her body. I'll grab a handful of black clay. I'll knead it to condition it just like we did before, and we'll roll it out nice and flat. I colored this the same way just by adding black acrylic paint to the clay and manipulating the clay until it was all well blended together. Okay, that looks like a pretty good size. I'm going to drape the black clay over top of the foam cone, that part that's going to be her skirt, and I'll press it to make sure that it has good contact to the foam beneath. I'll cut away any excess, and I'm going to roll it on the table to smooth it out. I'm going to use a round fondant cutter to cut some of the black clay out for the bottom, which I'll press into place. I want to make sure that this sits nice and flat. That's why I'm using the cutter. I just think it's easier. And we're going to incorporate that just like we did the other clay. Now we're going to wrap our egg shape with some of the black clay. Again, cutting away any excess and rolling it until it's nice and smooth, making sure that the egg is completely covered. To anchor these pieces together, I'll push a toothpick into the center of the cone, and then I'll slide the egg shape over top of the toothpick. I'm doing this so that the wider part of the egg is at the top, and the smaller part would be where the egg meets the cone. This way it looks more like a thin waist. You know what I'm saying? Like Batsy's got a girly figure. Wink wink. I roll a thin cane of black clay, which I'm going to push into the gap where the egg shape meets the cone. This will both make it appear as though the clay is one solid piece and also anchor the two pieces together. And of course, we're going to incorporate it by rolling over the seams so that the new clay meshes with the clay on our foam structure. We'll use another toothpick to anchor her pumpkin head to her body, and I'll do my best to make sure that the head is well centered on the body. We'll add another cane of clay in that gap between the head and the body, once again to secure it and also to kind of make it look like it's her collar. And as always, we'll incorporate it by rolling over the seams. She's going to need some arms, so we'll roll out a thicker cane of orange clay, rounding the ends. The ends are going to be the hands, so we want to make sure that they're nice and uniform and round. And we're going to cut that in half, and then we can set that aside for the moment because we're going to make her some sleeves. Rolling out more black clay, I'll use a square fondant cutter to cut out the two sleeves. I wrap her arms with the black squares, leaving a small amount of the orange peeking out, the rounded ends that are going to be her hands. I'll press the seams together, and I'll make sure that the top of her arm is covered with the black clay. Roll it around a wee bit, and that should do it. I want her sleeves to have cuffs, so I'm going to take some white clay, roll that into a cane, and then flatten it into a long rectangle with my rolling pin. Then I'm going to cut off small sections, enough to fit around the bottom of her sleeve, and we'll wrap them around, incorporating them just like we did with everything else. I cut a toothpick in half and pushed them on either side of her body where I wanted her arms to go, and added the arms. And now I'm incorporating them by rolling over the seams. Her arms will be in front of her and slightly down, and once that's done, we can set her aside to dry overnight. I thought Batsy should have a sign to advertise her skills, so I did some designing in Photoshop and created the shape of the sign, and then I used my laser cutter to quickly cut them out. You know I did. I love this laser cutter. So I cut a bat shape, which I gave a coat of Ceramcoat Oyster White, and I cut the sign shape, which I've given a coat of Ceramcoat Charcoal. I also painted a wooden spool and a dowel with charcoal. I thought the thread spool was the perfect base for an upholsterer / flag maker sign. I pulled out my silhouette cameo and designed and cut the lettering for Batsy's sign. I'm going to burnish the vinyl lettering into place. It's going to say Batsy Ross on the bat, and then on the sign it will say upholsterer and flag maker with a couple of bats for embellishment. Once I have my vinyl in place, I'm going to use a cosmetic sponge to pounce over the vinyl lettering with Mod Podge. This will prevent the paint from seeping beneath the vinyl and should give us nice crisp lines to our letters. Once the Mod Podge is dried, I use charcoal paint to add a top layer on the bat, and I'm going to give this 2 coats. And I will give the sign 2 coats of Oyster White. I'm going to leave the sign a little sketchy, slip-slappy painted, because I wanted that to have an old vintage and rustic look. Okay, the paint's dry, so we can pull up our vinyl and reveal the lettering. That's looking pretty good. Ha-cha-cha. I'm going to up the antiquing a level, so I pulled out my JoSonja Fruitwood gel stain, and I'm going to apply it to all the wooden pieces. I'll wipe it back with a soft cloth, and I'll keep going until I'm happy with it. You know what I'm saying? To distress it even more, I'm going to lightly sand each wood piece with my sanding block, just knocking off the edges and generally scuffing it up. You feel me? I wrapped the spool with some black and tan jute. I thought that was a really cute rustic embellishment. I just tucked the string under itself as I wrapped it. This way I can reuse the spool if I want to. No glue needed. I attached the bat at the top of the sign. I'm actually using Sobo glue because I couldn't get the lid off my wood glove. But this worked just fine. And I did add a dot of hot glue for that quick grab. I attached the dowel down the center of the back of the sign with hot glue. Now I can just pop the dowel into the spool and Batsy's sign is finished. I also gave this a coat of clear matte sealer. Okay, Batsy has sat overnight and she is well dried and ready for embellishments. I want Batsy to have a traditional jack-o'-lantern face, kind of like old Phil, remember him from a couple weeks ago? But it'll be a wee bit softer since she's a girl. So I'm painting in some triangular eyes and a triangular nose using my 000 detail brush and Ceramcoat charcoal. I'm going to give her a much softer mouth than I did with Phil. This is just going to be a simple smile, again with Ceramcoat charcoal. She won't have those jagged teeth that old Phil had. And of course she's going to need some eyebrows and some lashes. Yeah, so I went ahead and I painted some bats on the front of her skirt, totally forgetting that she's going to be holding a flag. So we're not really going to be able to see these, but I thought I'd give you a quick peek anyway. With the back of a paintbrush handle, I'm going to dot in her eyes with, what is this? Americana pumpkin spice right here at the top. So she's looking up. Now I created a little flag for her to hold from a scrap piece of muslin, and I painted it with charcoal and spiced pumpkin stripes. I also decided to add a bat to the center of her collar, kind of like a brooch. I'm using black paint to paint this in, and I'm going to add wee tiny bats on her cuffs too. I kept them really simple, just little strokes to kind of give the illusion of a bat. I'm grabbing my FolkArt floating medium to do a little shading. I'm dipping my brush into the medium to get a good healthy coat on there, working it into the bristles, and I'm going to scoop up some Americana burnt sienna onto the corner of my brush. I'll stroke this on my plate to blend the paint with the medium on the bristles. The paint will be darkest at the corner of the brush, and it will fade as it moves toward the middle of the brush, giving us a gradient of color. And I'm going to shade in between her ribs on her face with this. So I'm holding the corner of the brush where the paint is, where I want the darkest shadow, and I'm just going to float that in anywhere where I think it might need it. Of course, you could always do this by dry brushing it, but when I made Old Phil, I floated his face, so I wanted her to be consistent with him. That's why I'm doing it this way. Once I get the shading that I'm happy with, I'm going to shade around her features as well. Also, I outlined around her eyes, nose, and mouth using my detail brush and burnt sienna. I think this really helps her features stand out and gives them a more finished appearance. And I'm just dry brushing her cheeks with the burnt sienna as well. I start out light and build up my color until I'm happy with it. Also, I came back in and I floated around her hands where they meet her cuffs with burnt sienna. I almost forgot to do that. I go ahead and dot highlights in her eyes and her cheeks. At first I did it with maple sugar tan. It was too dark, so I went back over it with oyster white. I'm going to shade around her cuffs with a little bit of Ceramcoat maple sugar tan. This will give them a more rustic vintage look, I think. I'm going to shade around her dress with black, and I'm going to do this around the top of her cuffs, where her arms meet her body, and anywhere there would be a natural shadow. Now that the burnt sienna shading on her face is dry, I'm going to also add a little bit of shading with Hippo Gray. I feel like this adds more depth and gives it a more vintage, spooky feel, and this is how I did Old Phil, and like I said, I want her to be consistent with him. Once the Hippo Gray has dried, I'm going to come back in again and highlight the same areas with some of the oyster white just to lighten up her face and to give it a little lift, a little life. And while we have that oyster white on the go, I thought I would highlight around the bats on her skirt and on her collar. All the painting is done, and I'm going to use a cosmetic sponge to pounce on a top coat of DecoArt multi-purpose sealer. This will give it a nice finished look, and it'll protect the clay. To create the classic Batsy Ross bonnet, I stiffened a piece of muslin with starch, traced on a large circle, and I'm going to cut that out using my pinking shears. I had to cut a really large circle so that it would fit over her pumpkin-shaped head. I just took a guess and hoped that it worked, and it did. So I got lucky. This is probably like a 5 to 6 inch circle. The starch added a little extra body to the fabric, which made it much easier to handle. I did a basting stitch around the inside edge of the circle. I grabbed both ends of the thread and gathered the fabric into the bonnet shape. You want to be gentle when you're pulling the threads because you don't want them to break. I did a test fit, and then I realized I should maybe put some polyfill into the hat to give it more shape and body. So that's what I did. To add a wee bit more character, I used some of the Tim Holtz Vintage Photograph ink to stain the fabric, and then I came back in with some black ink and added that as well. I also made her a shawl from a strip of muslin, and I painted a little bat on there as well for embellishment. I'll also use the inks to stain the shawl and around the edges of the flag. Okay, now we can dress old Batsy. So I'm going to attach her hat to her head. I'm going to use a pin to hold it in place until I can adjust it just the way I like it. Then I'm going to come in and use some fabric glue and adhere the hat to her head. I'll use a dot of fabric glue to attach her shawl as well. For her base, I painted a 4-inch wood disc with 2 coats of Ceramcoat charcoal, and now I'm going to use rain gray to add some cobblestones. I shade each cobblestone with Hippo gray. And I float around the edge of the disc with Americana spiced pumpkin to pull in that orange. Once that's done, I'll give this a coat of clear matte sealer spray. Now we're going to attach her flag to her hands. So once again, I'm using a little bit of fabric glue. I don't want to forget Betsy's favorite wee pet, Fang. He's a black bat that I cut from felt, and he's going to perch right on the top of her bonnet, like so. And finally, I'll use both fabric glue and a dot of hot glue to attach Batsy to her stand. Let's take a look at good old Betsy. There she is, very proud of that flag. I think she turned out really cute. I love the idea of Revolutionary War era Halloween figures, so she'll be the perfect mate for old Phil. Let me know what you think. And here's her sign, advertising all her mad skills. She's quite the industrious lady. Many thanks to Shelly and Dawn for hosting today's collaboration. You'll find links to their channels in the description box, along with a link for today's creators playlist. Please be sure to watch all the videos, go show everybody some love, and you'll get some fabulous ideas for fall and Halloween projects. Please like, share, comment, and subscribe, and all that good stuff. Stay creative, my friends. Thanks for hanging with me. See you next time. Up all night with Monica.